Imagine this, it's 520 BC. The once mighty Jerusalem lies in rubble. The Jewish people, back from decades of exile in Babylon, are starting over. But something's missing. Enter Haggai, a prophet with a message so urgent, it's like a wake-up call from history itself. Welcome to the book of Haggai, 2 tiny chapters packed with big ideas. Let's set the stage. Again, the year is 520 BC. Under King Darius of Persia, a superpower stretching from India to Egypt. The Jews had been dragged into exile 70 years earlier when Babylon crushed their city and torched their temple. Now they're back, but life's tough. They're rebuilding homes, scraping by, and the temple, it's still a pile of stones. That's where Haggai steps in. Haggai's got fire in his voice. On August 29th, 520 BC, yep, we've got the exact date, he calls out to people. You're building your houses, but God's house is a wreck. No wonder your crops fail and your pockets are empty. See, the temple wasn't just a building. It was the heartbeat of their identity, their very connection to God. Culturally, it's like leaving your Wi-Fi off in a digital age. Total disconnect. Haggai's words hit hard. In just 24 days, the people start rebuilding. Chapter 1 is all about priorities, putting God first. Then chapter 2 flips the script. God promises something epic. The glory of this new temple, Haggai says, will outshine the old one. It's not about the gold or the size. It's about God's presence returning. And the people, they're fired up. So, what's this mean for us 2,500 years later? Haggai's world was chaotic. Political upheaval, economic struggle, spiritual drift. Sound familiar? His message cuts through time. What are we building in our own lives? Are we chasing our own stuff, careers, comfort, Netflix binges, while neglecting what really matters? Haggai says, get your priorities straight, and God's blessings will follow. But here's the kicker. Haggai's not just talking about a building. It's about hope. Back then, the temple pointed to something bigger. God dwelling with his people. Today it's a challenge. Where's God in your story? This little book dares us to rebuild. Not just walls, but faith, purpose, and community. And the promise? God's still with us, shaking things up, making all things new. 2 chapters, 1 prophet. A message that echoes from 520 BC. To the present day. Ready to dig in? The book of Haggai is waiting. Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the Fresh Catholic Bible Study track. This is episode 3 of a 3-episode study on the book of the prophet Haggai. And if you've been with us the first 2 episodes, you know Haggai is a very, very short book. Again, the visual here. What I'm holding up is 2 pages in my particular Bible. That's the book of Haggai. 2 pages, 2 chapters, 37 verses, but as we've been saying all along, small but mighty, because it is replete, as is all of the Old Testament, with life application lessons. And as we finish off this study in the book of Haggai, as we do chapter 2 in this episode 3, we'll see a number of additional life application lessons on top of the ones we've already seen. So the book of Haggai, small but mighty, a lot of life application lessons. This is the 3rd of 3 episodes. We'll do the 2nd and final chapter. So just as far as a quick review, episode number 1, if you've been with us, you know, is all episodes of the theology courses and the Bible studies. Episode 1 is always given over to laying down the foundation, providing the background, the backdrop, the context.
And then beginning in episode 2, that's when we actually start the topic. And in episode 2, we looked at chapter 1 of Haggai. And again, just as a way of a review, the Jewish people, they've been taken into exile. Assyria has invaded the northern kingdom. Babylon has invaded the southern kingdom. They've been taken into exile. Persia now has defeated those kingdoms. And now Persia has kind of inherited all the exiles. And King Cyrus, the king of Persia, issues a decree that all of the exiles who want to go back to the homeland to kind of rebuild the homeland are now free to go. Only a small portion of all of them actually go back, a remnant. And when they go back, they're met with total devastation. The city, Jerusalem, has been laid waste. The temple has been completely destroyed. The walls around the city are in rubble. It is total devastation. Yet they roll up their sleeves, and this small remnant begins to rebuild the homeland. But the enormity of the task and the opposition they're facing from the surrounding people who don't exactly want Jerusalem and the temple rebuilt, that starts to take its toll. So the rebuilding process slows down and grinds to a halt. But as we learned last episode in chapter 1, the rebuilding process of the city and the temple is grinding to a halt. But they're still building, aren't they? Remember, they're building now their own houses. And now we find out that what's been happening here is rather than them building God's house, the temple, they instead are building their own houses. Their priorities have been misplaced, and they've put their wants and needs over God's wants and needs. They want to do their thing rather than God's thing. They want to do their will rather than God's will. And God in chapter 1 of Haggai calls them out on it, all right? And basically says, look, I know what you're doing. I know why you're doing it. And what you should do basically is take a step back, take a deep breath, and kind of consider what you're doing here. Kind of take stock of what you're doing, your attitude and your behavior, and take a look at how misplaced your priorities are. You're putting your own wants and needs and will over God's wants and needs and will. Well, the people took that to heart. They did use that as a bit of self-reflection. They realized what they'd been doing. They realized they had their priorities misplaced. They owned up to it. And they basically got the rebuilding process back going again, in earnest. That's where we left chapter 1. Chapter 1 ends with the rebuilding process of the temple, particularly, up and running again. The people have been called out on what they've been doing. They've agreed God is right, they're wrong, and they've got the rebuilding process back going in earnest. And we said to close episode, the last episode, chapter 1, we said that at this point, it seems like a case of all's well that ends well. Everybody's living happily ever after. Let's roll the credits, because the building process has gotten back on track in earnest. And then I left us with a rather ominous tone. Remember, I said, well, wait a second. You know, that's chapter 1. We got a whole nother chapter to go, chapter 2. So chapter 2 has to have something in it. So maybe we better kind of hold off on rolling those credits. Maybe it's not a case of all's well that ends well yet. Maybe everybody's not living happily ever after yet, because there is a chapter 2, all right? And that's our job in this final episode, is to take a look at what happens in chapter 2 and how this story continues to play out and how it actually finishes. Now, you may recall in chapter 1, God is asking the people questions. Now again, he's God. He knows the answers. He knows what's in our minds. He knows what's in our hearts. But God is asking these people questions. He did it in chapter 1. We'll see it again in chapter 2. Because he wants them to kind of self-reflect and come up with the answers themselves. So we're not surprised that in chapter 2 starts with God asking them another question. Now again, we pick up chapter 2 at the end of chapter 1, right? The people have started the rebuilding of the temple in earnest, right? Now chapter 2 opens, God asks the people another question. He says, and we're looking at verses 3 and 4 in chapter 2, who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? Again, this house, the temple, right? So who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? And how do you see it now? Does it not seem like nothing in your eyes? So he asked kind of a series of questions, actually. How many of you saw the temple in its former glory? How do you see it now? And by comparison, does the temple you're rebuilding look like nothing compared to the former temple? Now, the former temple is Solomon's temple, right? Before the Babylonians invaded the southern kingdom, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple they destroyed was Solomon's temple, and it was magnificent. It was ornate. It was beautiful, it was large, it was everything you can imagine God's temple to be. It was just magnificent. Now, the people are rebuilding the temple, and they're getting started with it. They've laid the foundation, right? And God knows what they're thinking. As this rebuilding of the temple gets back going again, he knows that those of them that were old enough to see the former temple, Solomon's temple in all its glory, are taking a look at the temple they're rebuilding here, and they're starting to get disillusioned. They're starting to get discouraged. They're starting to get disappointed because the temple they're rebuilding looks puny. It looks pitiful by comparison with Solomon's temple. God knows that's what they're thinking. And God knows that comparing what they're rebuilding with the former temple, Solomon's temple, and the puniness and pitifulness of this compared to that, they're starting to get disillusioned and discouraged, and they're starting to get down again, right? So God poses the question. Those of you that were old enough to see the former temple, okay, by comparison, I know you're looking at the temple you're rebuilding and you're seeing it as puny and pitiful by comparison. And I know that because of that, you're starting to get disillusioned and discouraged, okay? Now, there's an old saying, comparison is the thief of joy. Because, and again, you're talking life application lessons. Here's the first one in chapter 2. We look around, right, and we compare ourselves with other people, whether it's the houses that they live in, the cars they drive, the jobs they have, the salaries they're earning, the lives it looks like they're living. And, if we get caught in a comparison game, there's always going to be somebody that has more than we do, okay? When we start comparing, that's a game we can't win. And whenever a lot of times I'll teach, right? And in the age of social media, where you're looking at people's Facebooks and Instagrams, you have to remember, by and large, you're looking at other people's highlight reels. You know, the content on their social media is curated to present a certain image of themselves, right? And here you are, you're comparing your real life with other people's highlight reels, and that's a game you're never going to win, because your real day-to-day life is never going to look like their curated highlight reels on social media. So comparison is the thief of joy. And that's what we're getting to here. By comparison, the rebuilt temple is looking nothing like Solomon's temple. And it's easy when you compare to get disillusioned, to get discouraged, to get disappointed, to get down, to lose your happiness, to lose your joy. And God is indicating to these people, He knows that that's what they're doing, and that's kind of what they're going through. As a result, the very next thing God does that we read here is He follows this with an exhortation. He says, pick it up in verse 4, now be strong, Zerubbabel, one of the leaders. Be strong, Joshua, another one of the leaders. Be strong, all you people of the land. So after God says, look, I know you're looking at this temple and it looks puny by comparison. I know you're starting to get discouraged and disillusioned and down, but be strong. Don't give up. And why? God tells them, I am with you. Okay? Whenever you're doing a work of God and you're doing it according to God's will and God's design and God's plan, no work of God is ever puny or pitiful. It's a work of God. It's glorious. And He's going to use it for whatever means He wants to use it for. That's that's what's coming through here. He's reminding the people, look, okay, you're doing a work of God. You're rebuilding my house. All right? And by virtue of that, it's glorious. No work of God is ever pitiful or puny. And that's why He says, be strong, keep going, I'm with you, because you're rebuilding my house. So, a series of questions followed by an exhortation. Now, He then goes on and He says, again, another question, right? And this is kind of interesting, because He says, look, don't look backward, look forward, okay? You build more than you see. Look beyond just the physical to the spiritual. In the Gospel of John, the bread of life discourse, when you've got 5,000 people, not counting women and children, so there's actually over 5,000 people, and they're out in the deserted place, and they don't have any food, and the disciples say, how are we going to feed them? And there's one boy amongst them that has 5 loaves and 2 fish, and the disciples say, what is this among so many? And Jesus says, bring the boy here. And He takes the 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? We know the story. And He multiplies them to such an extent that all the people eat, they eat their fill, and there's left over, okay? The 5 loaves and 2 fish looked pitiful. It looked puny in comparison to feeding the 5,000, all right? But God took that, multiplied it. All right? The 5 loaves and 2 fish, it was more than enough, as it turns out. So whenever we do God's work in God's way, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem to us, it's God's work, it's glorious, and He can take it and multiply it to whatever extent He wants. So He's exhorting these people, look, don't fixate on just the physical, okay? This is God's house. It's God's temple. It's by virtue of that, it's glorious. You're building much more than you see. Because remember what we said the significance of having a temple was. The temple was where the presence of God was manifested among the people. The temple was the place where the people would offer sacrifice to atone for their sins. So because of what the temple was and what it did, all right, that's what made it glorious. So God is exhorting the people, don't get bogged down in just the physical and the seemingly insignificance of it. It's God's work and it's glorious, and you're building more than you can see. And then he asks another question, okay? And this is a question that probably of all the questions he asks in the book of Haggai, this is probably the most curious. And we'll find it in verses 12 and 13, okay? Let me go ahead and read the question God asks them, and then we'll take it and kind of convert it into simple English, and then we'll find out what God is getting at. Because now God, knowing minds and hearts, has discerned something else in the minds and hearts of the people that he's kind of asking them to consider by throwing this question out at them. Let's take a look at the actual question as it's recorded, okay? Thus says the Lord of hosts. And here's the questions. If someone carries sanctified meat in the fold of a garment, and the fold touches bread or soup or wine or oil or any other food, do they become sanctified? The answer is no. If a person defiled from contact with a corpse touches any of these, do they become defiled? The answer is yes. So at this point, let's hit the pause button, because the book of Haggai is recording these people and their struggles from the enormity of the task, opposition from the outside, their own disillusionment and discouragement of how this temple doesn't look anything like the former one. And all, you know, and God is trying to bring these people through all of that, right? And then all of a sudden, he's asking them the question about sanctified meat and touching dead corpses. And you're saying, well, wait a second. Where did this come from? What does this have to do about anything? What is God even getting at? And it's a fair question, because if you look at it from the surface, you're going, what? Wait a second, have I lost the thread here? Have I missed something? Well, again, God knowing their minds and knowing their hearts, right? They've looked at what they're building. It looks puny compared to the former temple. God is saying, don't be deceived by that. You're doing a work of God. It's glorious. I'm with you. See beyond it. To what the temple is and the significance of it. But then he detects something else in terms of the people's minds and hearts. Yes, they're rebuilding the temple. Yes, they're working through their discouragement and disillusionment because it's not as grand as Solomon's temple. They're doing it. They're rebuilding it. But their hearts aren't in it. They're going through the motions. They're doing it in a perfunctory fashion. Yes, they're doing God's work physically, but they're not doing it with the heart of God. They're going through the motions. They're doing it kind of in an obligatory, perfunctory fashion. God knows this. So again, he poses a series of questions to get them to kind of self-reflect. And you're saying, Charles, okay, fair enough. But the series of questions he poses them sound kind of weird. Sanctified meat, touching dead corpses. What is God getting at? Well, what God is getting at is this. He's basically saying, look, okay, if something is holy and it touches something unholy, can it make that which is unholy holy? And the answer is no. In other words, he's saying, can holiness rub off? And the answer is no. And then he reverses it. He says, if something unholy touches something that's holy, can it make the holy thing unholy? And the answer is yes. In other words, can unholiness rub off? So let's not kind of get lost in the sanctified meat and the dead corpses part of these questions. What he's basically asking the people is, can holiness rub off? And the answer is no. And then he says, can unholiness rub off? And the answer is yes. Now, what does this have to do with the people physically rebuilding the temple, but their hearts are not in it? They're kind of going through the motions. They're doing it in a very perfunctory fashion. What he's trying to get across to the people is, okay, people, you're doing the work of God. You're rebuilding my house. You're working through, the enormity of the task, the opposition, the temptation to get disillusioned and discouraged because it's not as grand as the former one. You're doing the work of God, okay? That's good, and I'm pleased with that. But doing the work of God is not good enough. You've got to do the work of God with a heart for God. Your heart has to be in it. Because that's the second aspect. Yes, there's an external part. Whenever we're doing the work of God, there's an external part where we're doing the actual work, whatever it may be, right? But there's also the internal part where we've got to do the actual work with a heart for God. And God is detecting in these people that, their hearts aren't in it. They're rebuilding a temple, but their hearts aren't in it. And what he's trying to get across is, just because you're doing holy work, rebuilding the temple, doesn't necessarily make you holy people. Doing holy work does not make you holy people. The holiness of your work doesn't necessarily rub off on the holiness of you, especially if you're doing it where your heart is not in it. Because again, what he's trying to get to is holiness, that comes from the grace of God. I can teach 1,000,000 theology courses, but that doesn't in and of itself make me holy. I can teach 1,000,000 Bible studies, but that in itself doesn't necessarily make me holy. I can read theology books. I can read scripture, but those things in and of themselves don't make me holy. I can even go to church. I can go to Mass. But just my physical body being in church and standing up and sitting down and kneeling and responding doesn't necessarily make me holy, all right? So what God is trying to get across to these people, and by extension to us, the life application lesson here is, hey people, yes, you're doing the work of God, that's good, and I'm pleased with that, but that's not enough. You got to do the work of God with a heart for God. Because just doing holy things doesn't necessarily make you holy, all right? So he wants them to get across, yeah, you got to do this, but you got to do it with the right heart, the right attitude, the right mindset. You can't do it just to do it. And then he reverses it. He says, but, can unholiness rub off, all right? And in that case, The answer is yes. All right. Again, a couple of examples. All right. Can holiness rub off? No. So if Simon is very holy, let's assume he's holy. Okay. Is me being around him, is his holiness going to rub off on me just by me being in the same room with him? The answer is no. Okay. Everybody is responsible, so to speak, for the state of their own souls, right? And I can't get into heaven riding Simon's coattails. On the day of my particular judgment, Simon is not going to be standing next to me. It's going to be me and Jesus, right? So doing holy work, being around holy people doesn't necessarily make you holy. Now, having said that, it can certainly provide the right environment, all right? Reading theology books, reading scripture, going to Mass. Obviously, all right, those are environments, right, that can lead me to holiness, but they don't in and of themselves make me holy. Being around Simon, if he's a good role model, provides a good environment for me to try and become holy. But Simon's presence in and of itself magically is not going to make me holy. However, God is telling these people, and by extension us, you got to be careful, okay? Because being around unholy people, all right, and being in unholy environments can lead you to become unholy. All right? They can take you away from holiness. So what he's trying to get across to the people and what he's trying to get across to us is when you're doing the work of God, you have to do it with the right mindset. You have to do it right with the right heart. Because doing holy things doesn't necessarily make you a holy person. That's what he's trying to get through here. In fact, if you think about it, the poster children, so to speak, of what God is trying to get across here were the religious leaders of Jesus' day. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, all of those groups. You know, on the surface, they did all the right things. They checked off all the boxes. They went through all the rituals, right? But as we know, that didn't lead them to become holy. In fact, Jesus repeatedly would call them hypocrites because they went through the motions, all right? But they didn't have the proper heart. So if we wanted a New Testament example of what God is telling these people in the Old Testament, the Jewish religious leaders would be a perfect example of what God is trying to get across to these people and by extension to us. Now, he finishes up in chapter 2 with kind of another interesting thing, okay? He says, okay, I'm going to make Zerubbabel a signet ring. Now again, you might be saying, okay, Zerubbabel is one of the leaders, and Haggai's last message in this book is telling the people that God is going to make Zerubbabel a signet ring. And you might be tempted to say again, okay, well, what does that have to do about the people working through all they need to work through to build God's temple? Well, a signet ring, back then a signet ring was a ring that had your image carved in it. And that's what you used as your signature. That was your symbol of power and authority, okay? So when God says, I'm going to make Zerubbabel a signet ring, what he's telling the people is, and again, let's go back to provide a little context. Let's go back to the exile. When the Babylonians exiled the people, The worry was, with the people exiled, the royal line of David, the Davidic line, will have been snuffed out. And that was a big problem because the Messiah, Jesus, is supposed to come from the line of David. He's supposed to come from the Davidic line. So the thinking and the worry was that if the Davidic line was snuffed out during the exile, no Davidic line, no Messiah. Well, as it turns out, if we go to the Gospel of Matthew, and he begins his gospel with a genealogy. And remember what we said about genealogies in episode 1, that oftentimes we look at them as a list of long names of people that lived long ago, most of whom we can barely pronounce, so we're tempted to skip over it. And we said we shouldn't, because to a Jewish person, genealogies were everything. If we go into the Gospel of Matthew and we read through Matthew's genealogy, and he's going through all of this genealogy, and he finally gets to Jesus, if we look through the genealogy, right, we will see the name Zerubbabel. So, Zerubbabel is part of the genealogy of Jesus. So Zerubbabel, being one of the leaders that have brought this remnant back to rebuild the temple, okay, the very fact that there is a Zerubbabel indicates that the royal line, the Davidic line, has not been snuffed out. That somehow it went underground and continued. And now it's broken back through the surface in the presence of Zerubbabel. So when God tells the people, I'm going to make Zerubbabel a signet ring, what he's telling them is, look, the Davidic line, the line that the long-awaited, long-expected Messiah, Savior, King is going to come from, that wasn't snuffed out in the exile. It has continued, and it has continued in the person of Zerubbabel. So what that's telling the people is God is still working his plan. He is still keeping his promises. And his plan cannot and will not be thwarted. And people right here and now, he's telling these people, in you coming back and rebuilding God's temple, you people here and now are playing your role in God's continuing plan. You're playing your role in God continuing to keep his promises. So no matter what it may look like, even if it's not as grand as Solomon's temple, no matter, what opposition you may face, no matter what discouragement you might feel or disillusionment or down, okay, you're doing God's work. Make sure you do it with a heart for God, because you are part of God's continuing plan. This is your role. This is your time. And then he indicates that eventually, okay, there's going to be even a greater temple than this. So however this temple may look, take heart, because there's going to be even a greater temple than this. And there was in two aspects. Because Herod's temple, the temple Herod would build, which would turn out to be even grander than Solomon's temple, Herod's temple was an extension of this temple. So the temple they're building now, puny though it may seem in comparison with Solomon's temple, This temple is what Herod is eventually going to expand on and create a temple even more glorious than Solomon's. So people, you are building more than you see. And then there's going to be a temple even more grand and glorious than Herod's temple, and that is going to be the Messiah and Savior himself. He is the new and ultimate temple. All right? So what you're doing here and now might not look like much in your eyes, but be assured that it's part of God's plan. And if you do God's work with a heart for God, okay, you are part of God's design and plan. And whatever small part you may play now, God is going to use it and make it more glorious and grand. Just like he took those 5 loaves and 2 fish from that boy and multiplied them to feed the 5,000 and had leftovers. Don't be discouraged by looking at what you're doing and thinking, oh, this is not much. I'm just one person. I'm just doing one thing. And the grand scheme of things, really, what's the use? If it's God's work and you do it with the heart of God, the use is unlimited, because we're talking about God here. And that's what he's trying to get across to these people, okay? Do God's work with a heart of God, and no matter what it may look like, be assured that God can take it and, in a sense, multiply it. God can take it and use it to continue his plan, which cannot and will not be thwarted. So that's the book of Haggai. Those are all the life application lessons this small little 2-chapter, 37-verse, 2-page book continued. But hopefully, beyond just this Bible study, the other thinking that we here at Fresh Catholic had is to use this Bible study, because it was small and it was rather short, 3 episodes, as a way of raising awareness that the Old Testament is completely applicable to our lives here and now. It is replete with life lessons if we just give it that chance. And here in this little 2-page, 2-chapter, 37-verse book about people coming back from exile and trying to fight through all kinds of external and internal difficulties to rebuild God's temple, how many life application lessons we drew from this over the past couple of episodes. So with that, we'll bring our episode number 3, chapter 2 to a close. We'll bring our Bible study in the book of Haggai to a close. Hopefully, I've done a good job in going through the actual book itself and then drawing out the life application lessons from it. So until our next Bible study, from the studios of FreshCatholic.com, I'm Charles Merritt. Take care and God bless.